20 years, $2 trillion. And for what? America went to Afghanistan to destroy terror, but instead, it built a $2 trillion Ijushan. How did the richest, most powerful nation on earth spend 2 decades and a fortune only to watch it all collapse in a matter of days? To understand this, we need to go back to a day that changed the world forever. September 11th, 2001. The Twin Towers fell, and a nation was plunged into shock, grief, and a burning desire for justice. The enemy had a name, Al-Qaeda, and they had a haven. Afghanistan, under the rule of the Taliban, in the smoke and rubble of Ground Zero. A decision was made. It was swift, emotional, and absolute. America was going to war. The objective seemed clear, almost simply. First, topple the Taliban regime that harbored the terrorists. Second, dismantle and eliminate Al-Qaeda, ensuring they could never again launch such a devastating attack. President George W. Bush addressed the nation and the world with a promise. This would be a short, necessary war, a targeted strike to root out evil and make America safe again. The world largely agreed. The initial invasion, Operation Enduring Freedom, began on October 7th, 2001. And that's when the meter started running. At first, the costs seemed manageable, part of the price of national security. The initial wave involved special forces, air power, and a coalition of international partners. Boots hit the ground. The first military bases were established, sprawling cities of steel and canvas rising from the dust. Supply lines snaked across continents, a logistical miracle of fuel, food, ammunition, and equipment. The initial military campaign was a stunning success. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. Their fighters melted away into the mountains and across the border. Kabul fell. It looked like the promise of a short war was being kept. The primary objective seemed complete. But war is a beast with its own appetite. The cost wasn't just in bombs and bullets. It was in the daily expense of maintaining a massive military presence thousands of miles from home. Every soldier deployed costs about $1 million per year. Every flight, every vehicle, every meal added to a bill that was quietly growing in the background. We built vast airfields like Bagram and Kandahar, mini Americas with their own power grids, water treatment plants, and fast food chains. We flew in everything, from armored vehicles to bottled water. The logistical chain was a modern marvel, but it was also a fire hose of money, spraying cash across the Afghan landscape. The initial budget for the war was just a fraction of what it would become. In the early 2000s, Congress was authorizing tens of billions, numbers that were huge but seemed justifiable in the post-9/11 world. The war was framed as an existential fight for freedom, and you can't put a price tag on that, right? Or so we were told. The focus was on victory, not accounting. But as the Taliban fell, a new mission emerged, almost overnight. It wasn't enough to just leave. We had to rebuild. We had to create a new Afghanistan, a stable, democratic nation that would be an ally to the West and never again become a sanctuary for terror. This was nation building on an epic scale. And this is where the spending truly spiraled out of control. We weren't just fighting a war anymore. We were trying to construct a country from scratch. We funded a new Afghan army, a new police force, new government ministries. We built schools, hospitals, roads, and dams. On paper, it was a noble cause. In reality, it was like pouring water into a bucket full of holes. The projects were ambitious, but they were often designed in Washington, D.C., with little understanding of the realities on the ground. Did a remote village need a state-of-the-art school if there were no teachers to staff it? Did a province need a modern highway if local warlords controlled it and charged illegal tolls? These questions were rarely asked. The goal was to spend the money allocated by Congress, to show progress, to file reports filled with success metrics. The incentive was to spend, not to spend wisely. The cost meter wasn't just ticking anymore. It was spinning like a slot machine. Hundreds of billions were allocated for reconstruction. This money flowed through a complex pipeline of government agencies, international contractors, and local partners. And at every step of the way, a little bit or a lot was siphoned off. It created a shadow economy, one based not on producing goods, but on capturing a piece of the foreign aid waterfall. This wasn't just corruption. It was the entire system. Warlords we once fought became our allies in Reconstruction, paid handsomely for their cooperation. Government officials in Kabul built mansions with money meant for public services. A new elite class emerged in Afghanistan, their wealth directly tied to the continuation of the American presence. They had no incentive for the war to ever end. Their entire livelihood depended on it. By the late 2000s, the war had changed. The initial fight against Al-Qaeda had morphed into a grueling counterinsurgency against a resurgent Taliban, funded by the very chaos and corruption our spending had helped create. Our soldiers were fighting and dying to protect a system that was fundamentally broken. The mission had become vague, the goals unclear. Was it about killing terrorists? Building democracy? Protecting women's rights? Depending on who you asked, you'd get a different answer. The one constant was the money. Year after year, the budget requests went to Congress, and year after year, they were approved. The war in Afghanistan became a line item, a permanent part of the federal budget. Questioning it became politically difficult. No one wanted to be seen as cutting funding for the troops. So the checks kept getting written. We were spending billions on training an Afghan army that suffered from ghost soldiers' SNEMs. On a payroll who didn't exist, their salaries pocketed by commanders. We spent millions on projects that were never finished or were built so poorly they were unusable. One report found we spent $43 million on a single gas station. It was a cycle of waste, fueled by good intentions and a lack of accountability. The $2 trillion figure is almost too big to comprehend. It includes the direct costs of war and reconstruction, but also the interest on the debt we took on to pay for it, and the long-term cost of caring for our veterans. $2 trillion could have rebuilt America's infrastructure, funded education for generations, or solved global health crises. Instead, it vanished into the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan, leaving behind a ghost government and a military that would fold in 11 days. We thought we were fighting a war against the Taliban, but the real enemy was invisible. It was a system that fed on conflict, a machine designed to keep going, no matter the costs in lives or treasure. Soon, America would discover a problem far more dangerous than the Taliban, a war economy that had taken on a life of its own, an economy that could no longer be stopped. The war in Afghanistan wasn't just fought by soldiers. While brave men and women put their lives on the line for their country, another group descended on the region with a very different motive. As the saying went, some went to fight, others went to get rich. This is the story of how the Afghanistan War became one of the most profitable business ventures in modern history, and how $2 trillion vanished into the pockets of a select few. But to truly understand where the money went, we need to look beyond the military and into the world of private military contractors. Almost immediately after the invasion, a gold rush began. The U.S. government, stretched thin and needing specialized skills, turned to private companies to handle everything from security and logistics to construction and training. These weren't small operations. We're talking about massive corporations like Halliburton's subsidiary KB, DynCorp, and Blackwater, which later became Z Services and then Academy. Their role grew exponentially over the years. At certain points, the number of contractors on the ground actually outnumbered U.S. soldiers. Think about that for a second. For every soldier in uniform, there was at least one, sometimes more, private employee working alongside them, but with a crucial difference. They were there to make a profit, and profit they did. The contracts were often awarded with little oversight, leading to what can only be described as a feeding frenzy. The government was spending money at an unprecedented rate, and the contractors were more than happy to bill for it. This led to some truly mind-boggling examples of waste. Let's talk about the infamous scandals that made headlines. Remember the reports of the Pentagon paying nearly $300 for a single coffee cup? These weren't just any cups. They were special self-heating mugs for transport planes. But investigations revealed that the company was charging exorbitant prices, knowing the government would pay. Then there were the $40,000 tents, the $1,000 nails, and the reports of contractors billing for services that were never even rendered. One of the most notorious examples was the case of a company contracted to build a road. They charged millions, but the road was so poorly constructed it washed away in the first rainy season. The company was paid in full, and then they were paid again to fix it. It was a cycle of spending with almost no accountability. Why did this happen? A key reason was the use of cost-plus contracts. Instead of a fixed price, the government agreed to pay for the contractor's costs, plus a guaranteed percentage of profit on top. This created a perverse incentive. The more a contractor spent, the more money they made. There was no reason to be efficient or to save money. In fact, it was more profitable to be wasteful. If a pot needed to be shipped from the US, why find a local supplier when you could charge for expensive international air freight and pocket a larger percentage? This system created an entire ecosystem built on profiting from the conflict. The war wasn't just a military campaign. It became a business model. For these corporations, a prolonged war meant a steady stream of revenue. Peace was bad for business. A stable, functioning Afghanistan would mean the end of lucrative contracts. The security sector was particularly profitable. Private security firms were paid billions to protect diplomats, military bases, and supply convoys. While some provided essential services, the industry was plagued with problems. There were accusations of contractors hiring local warlords for protection, essentially paying the very people the military was supposed to be fighting. This created a bizarre and counterproductive dynamic where U.S. taxpayer money was indirectly funding the insurgency. The scale of this shadow economy was staggering. Billions were funneled into these private hands, creating a new class of war profiteers. Executives and shareholders of these companies became incredibly wealthy. They were selling the war, and business was booming. Think about the logistical challenges. Everything from fuel and food to bullets and bottled water had to be transported into a landlocked, mountainous country with poor infrastructure. This was a monumental task, and private companies stepped in to manage the supply chain. But with little oversight, this became another avenue for graft. Fuel trucks, known as the jingle trucks, were a common sight, but so were stories of ghost trucks that were billed for but never existed, or trucks that would sell a portion of their fuel on the black market before reaching their destination. The problem was systemic. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, was created to track this spending and root out waste. Over the years, their reports painted a damning picture. They documented case after case of fraud, abuse, and failed projects. But despite their efforts, the money continued to flow. The machine was too big, the contracts too complex, and the political will to truly clamp down on the profiteering was often lacking. The human cost of this privatization was also significant. Contractors, who often operated in a legal gray area, were involved in numerous violent incidents that strained relations with the Afghan population. Unlike soldiers, who were subject to the uniform code of military justice, holding contractors accountable for their actions proved incredibly difficult. So, while soldiers fought and died, a parallel war was being waged for profit. The promise was that privatization would be more efficient and cost-effective than using the military for everything. The reality was the opposite. It created a system where waste wasn't just a byproduct. It was an integral part of the business plan. The $2 trillion price tag of the war wasn't just spent on bombs and salaries. A massive chunk of it was siphoned off by companies that turned conflict into a commodity. The war in Afghanistan became a self-perpetuating economic engine, driven by an endless supply of taxpayer money. But where did all this money ultimately go, even with all the contractor profits? It doesn't fully explain how an entire nation-building project could consume trillions of dollars and still end in collapse. The answer lies in projects that were designed to rebuild Afghanistan, but often existed only on paper. Imagine a school built with American tax dollars, fully equipped with desks, chairs, and books. Now, imagine that school is just a drawing on a piece of paper. Billions of dollars were spent on projects in Afghanistan that, quite literally, never existed. This is the story of the ghost projects, one of the most shocking chapters in the $2 trillion war. The official records are filled with success stories. Thousands of new schools, hundreds of modern hospitals, and miles of freshly paved roads connecting remote villages to bustling cities. These were the projects meant to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, to show them the benefits of a partnership with the West. The reports sent back to Washington painted a picture of incredible progress. Money was being spent, and on paper, Afghanistan was being rebuilt brick by brick. But when auditors from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction Went to verify these projects on the ground. They found something startling. So, where did the money for these ghost projects go? A huge portion was siphoned off through systemic corruption. Here's how it often worked. A contract would be awarded, usually to a local construction company with deep connections to powerful warlords or politicians. The company would receive a massive upfront payment to begin construction. But instead of buying cement and hiring workers, the money would be distributed among a network of corrupt officials. A cut for the local governor, a cut for the police chief, a cut for the tribal elder. By the time the money trickled down, there was nothing left for the actual project. To cover their tracks, they would submit fake progress reports, sometimes using photos of buildings in completely different countries, claiming them as their own completed work. The American and NATO officials overseeing these contracts were often caught in a difficult position. They were under immense pressure to show results, to prove that the nation-building strategy was working. Admitting that millions of dollars had just been stolen would be a catastrophic failure on their watch. So, many turned a blind eye. It was easier to approve the paperwork, tick the box, and report another successful project than to confront the deeply entrenched networks of corruption. This created a vicious cycle. The more money that was proven to be spent successfully, the more Congress would approve for the next budget. The system incentivized looking the other way. And it wasn't just buildings that were ghosts. The Afghan National Army and police forces were plagued by ghost soldiers and ghost police. This was a scam on an epic scale. Local commanders would inflate the number of troops under their command, adding thousands of non-existent names to the payroll. Every month, the United States would transfer money to pay the salaries for this phantom army. The commanders would then pocket the salaries of the ghost soldiers, becoming fabulously wealthy. At one point, auditors estimated that up to a third of the entire Afghan security force might not exist. We were funding an army of ghosts to fight a very real enemy. Think about the implications of that. Not only was it a staggering waste of money, but it meant that the actual fighting force was much smaller and weaker than anyone in Washington believed. Military planners were making strategic decisions based on wildly inaccurate data. They thought they had 300,000 Afghan troops ready to fight, but the real number on the ground was far, far lower. This is one of the key reasons why the Afghan army collapsed so quickly when American forces finally withdrew. It wasn't just a lack of will. In many places, it was a lack of actual soldiers. The SIGAR reports from this era are devastating to read. John Sopko, the head of the agency, repeatedly warned Congress about the scale of the problem. His auditors documented case after case of blatant fraud. They found a 64,000 square foot command and control facility at Camp Leatherneck that cost $36 million and was never used, not for a single day. They found a natural gas filling station that cost $43 million in a country where almost no cars were converted to run on natural gas. It was an economic impossibility from the start. In one of the most famous examples, the U.S. spent nearly $500 million on cargo planes for the Afghan Air Force. The planes, however, were old, notoriously unreliable, and incredibly expensive to maintain. They were completely unsuitable for the Afghan environment. After spending years and millions more trying to keep them in the air, the entire fleet was eventually sold for scrap metal for just $32,000. A $500 million investment turned into literal junk. When confronted with these findings, the response was often a shrug. One official famously told an auditor, "We can't trace where the money went. It had disappeared into a black hole of corruption, a complex web of shell companies, offshore bank accounts, and bags of cash delivered in the dead of night." The warlords and political elites who had collaborated with the U.S. were the primary beneficiaries. They built lavish mansions in Kabul and Dubai, sent their children to expensive schools in Europe, and amassed fortunes beyond imagination, all while their country remained one of the poorest in the world. The scale of this waste is hard to comprehend. It wasn't just a few bad apples or isolated incidents. It was a fundamental feature of the entire war effort. The rush to spend money, the lack of oversight, and the willingness to partner with corrupt actors created the perfect storm for fraud. The goal was no longer to build a stable Afghanistan. For many, the goal became to keep the money flowing for as long as possible. The war itself had become a business. This wasn't just a financial failure. It was a moral one. The ghost schools meant real children were denied an education. The ghost hospitals meant real people died from treatable illnesses. The ghost soldiers meant real soldiers were outmanned and overrun on the battlefield. Every dollar wasted was a betrayal of the American taxpayer and, more importantly, a betrayal of the Afghan people who had placed their hopes in the promise of a better future. So why did it continue? If the auditors and inspectors were screaming from the rooftops that the money was being stolen and wasted, why did the United States keep writing the checks? The answer is complex and leads us directly into the final, tragic phase of the war. Yet despite the waste, despite the fraud, despite the clear evidence that the strategy was failing, America continued pouring money in because leaving became more expensive than staying. The war had become a trap with no exit. America wanted to leave Afghanistan, but the war had learned how to survive without an enemy. This is the story of a trap with no exit, a 20-year cycle that turned a mission into a machine that consumed trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, only to end in a way that shocked the entire world. The years began to blur together. One president left office, another took his place. The promises echoed through the halls of power, broadcast across television screens, and whispered in the homes of military families, "We will bring our troops home soon." The words became a familiar refrain, a comforting melody of hope. But with each passing year, the melody soured. Every time a withdrawal deadline approached, a familiar pattern would emerge. A new, urgent report would land on the president's desk, its pages filled with stark warnings and grim predictions. The message was always the same. If America leaves now, the entire Afghan state, the government, the army, everything we've built, will collapse. Not in months, but in weeks. The choice was a political nightmare. No president wanted to be the one who lost Afghanistan. The fear of being blamed for a catastrophic failure, for watching a country crumble after so much investment, was paralyzing. And so, the decision was always postponed. More troops, more time, and most importantly, more money. The war had found its own perverse form of life support. It no longer needed a clear enemy or a defined mission to keep going. It just needed the fear of its own ending. The financial cost was staggering, spiraling from billions into the trillions. To justify this immense spending, America embarked on one of the most ambitious nation-building projects in history. The centerpiece of this effort was the Afghan National Army. The plan seemed logical on paper: train and equip a local force that could eventually stand on its own, secure its own country, and allow American troops to finally come home. The numbers looked impressive. Reports boasted of hundreds of thousands of Afghan soldiers trained, equipped with the latest American gear, and ready to defend their nation. But reality on the ground told a different story. The army that looked so formidable on spreadsheets was, in many areas, a ghost. Corruption was rampant, a cancer eating away at the very core of the mission. The problem of ghost soldiers was an open secret. Afghan commanders would inflate the number of troops on their payrolls, creating fictional names to collect salaries that went straight into their own pockets. So, while Washington was sending funds to pay for a 300,000-strong army, the actual number of fighting men was a fraction of that. The equipment meant for these soldiers often met a similar fate. Weapons, vehicles, and even fuel would disappear, sold on the black market, sometimes ending up in the hands of the very insurgents they were meant to fight. Soldiers who did exist were often poorly supplied. Stories emerged of troops lacking food, ammunition, and even boots, all while their commanders grew rich. The system wasn't just broken, it was actively working against its own purpose. This created a vicious, self-sustaining cycle. American funding poured in to build the Afghan army. A significant portion of that funding was siphoned off through corruption, weakening the army from within. This weakened army would then struggle to contain the insurgency, leading to military setbacks and instability. These failures would then be used as evidence that Afghanistan wasn't ready, that it still needed American support. And so, the solution was always the same: more funding. The war had become a business. It was no longer about winning, it was about sustaining. For 2 decades, this cycle kept turning. Funding led to corruption, corruption led to collapse, and the threat of collapse led to more funding. The war was no longer a mission with a clear objective. It had become an industry, a complex machine with countless gears. There were the military contractors who profited from security, logistics, and reconstruction. There were the corrupt officials in Kabul who built mansions with aid money. There were the generals in Washington who built careers on managing the conflict. The machine had become too big, too complex, and too profitable for anyone to have the power, or perhaps the will, to turn it off. To the outside world, the narrative was one of slow, steady progress. News reports showed graduation ceremonies for new Afghan recruits, ribbon cuttings for new schools and bridges, and American generals speaking confidently about the growing capabilities of their Afghan partners. The world was led to believe that Afghanistan was getting stronger, that the $2 trillion investment was yielding results. The foundation, we were told, was solid. And then, in the summer of 2021, the machine finally sputtered to a halt. The final withdrawal was announced. No more delays, no more extensions. This time, it was real. Intelligence estimates, once again, predicted a collapse, but they gave the Afghan government months, perhaps even a year, after the American departure. It was a dire forecast, but it offered a sliver of time, a chance for the Afghan army to prove its worth. But the rot was far deeper than anyone in Washington was willing to admit. The ghost army, the product of 2 decades of corruption and self-deception, was about to face a real enemy without its American lifeline. What happened next wasn't a slow decline. It was a catastrophic implosion that defied all predictions. The world watched, stunned, as an army built over 20 years. An army supported by $2 trillion of American treasure. An army that was supposed to be the pillar of a new nation, fell in just 11 days. And then, after 20 years of war, sacrifice, and endless promises, the world witnessed a moment that shocked history. 20 years, $2 trillion, and it ended in a single weekend. How could the world's greatest superpower, after 2 decades of war, investment, and nation building, watch it all crumble in a matter of days? This is the final chapter in our series on the Afghanistan War. The collapse. The year is 2021. The United States announces its final withdrawal of troops, setting a deadline for September 11th, a date heavy with symbolism. American intelligence assessments at the time predicted that the Afghan government and its security forces could hold out for at least 6 months, maybe even a year, against the Taliban. What happened next defied all expectations and shocked the world. It wasn't months. It wasn't even weeks. It was days. As the last American soldiers packed up and left key bases like Bagram Airfield, often in the dead of night, a power vacuum was created. The Taliban, which had been patiently waiting and consolidating its power in rural areas, launched a lightning-fast offensive. Province after province, city after city, fell to them with astonishing speed. Herat, Kandahar, Mazar-i-Sharif, Meghar, urban centers that were supposed to be government strongholds were captured, often without a single shot being fired. This brings us to the core of the collapse. The Afghan National Security Forces. The answer is complex and heartbreaking. It wasn't just a military failure. It was a crisis of confidence. For years, these soldiers had been fighting and dying, but they were propped up by critical American support air power, intelligence, and logistics. When that support was pulled out, the entire system began to unravel. Think about it from the perspective of an Afghan soldier in a remote outpost. Your paycheck, often skimmed by corrupt officials, hasn't arrived in months. Your food and ammunition are running low because the supply lines, once managed by American contractors, are now unreliable or non. You hear on the radio that the city next door has fallen. Your commanders are fleeing or cutting deals with the enemy. And crucially, when you're under attack, you look to the sky for the American jets that have always saved you before. But this time the sky's empty. Do you fight to the death for a government that has already abandoned you? Or do you lay down your weapon and go home to your family? For tens of thousands of soldiers, the choice was tragically simple. This wasn't a universal story of cowardice. Many Afghan units, especially the commandos, fought bravely to the very end, but they were isolated, overwhelmed, and unsupported. The psychological impact of the American withdrawal was devastating. It sent a clear message. The game was over. The government in Kabul, plagued by corruption and infighting, had lost all legitimacy in the eyes of its own people and its own soldiers. President Ashraf Ghani, a leader who had promised to stand and fight, fled the country by helicopter as the Taliban entered the capital. The symbolic head of the state had abandoned ship, and the state itself dissolved almost instantly. Then came the images that will forever define the end of this war. The chaos at Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul. Desperate people who had worked with the Americans, who believed in a different future for Afghanistan women's rights activists. Journalists, interpreters flooded the tarmac. They saw the departing American planes as their only hope of escape from Taliban rule. We all saw the harrowing footage. People clinging to the sides of a C-17 transport plane as it taxied down the runway, some falling to their deaths. It was a scene of pure desperation, a visceral and public spectacle of a failed mission. The evacuation itself was a monumental, frantic effort. For 2 weeks, the airport became a tiny island of American control in a city now run by the Taliban. Military planes flew in and out in a constant, desperate rhythm, airlifting over 120,000 people. But for every person who made it out, many more were left behind, their fates uncertain. The operation was tragically marred by a suicide bombing at the airport's Abbey Gate, carried out by ISIS-K, which killed 13 U.S. service members and over 170 Afghans. It was a final, bloody punctuation mark on a 20-year conflict. On August 30th, 2021, the last American soldier, Major General Chris Donahue, boarded the final C-17 flight out of Kabul. The war was officially over. The Taliban, the very group the U.S. had invaded to remove from power, was once again in control of Afghanistan. And the $2 trillion. What did it buy? This is the question that hangs over everything. That money built roads that are now crumbling. It funded schools that are now closed to girls. It paid for an army that vanished in an instant. The money was meant to build a stable, democratic state, but much of it was siphoned off by corruption, wasted on poorly conceived projects, or funneled into a war economy that benefited contractors and warlords more than the Afghan people. The very influx of so much cash, with so little oversight, arguably fueled the corruption that rotted the Afghan government from the inside out, making its collapse inevitable. So, was the war lost on the battlefield, or was it lost in the budget? It seems the answer is both. It was lost in the firefights in Helmand and the mountains of the Hindu Kush, but it was also lost in the spreadsheets in Washington and the phantom payrolls of ghost soldiers, and in day-no-bid contracts that made a few people rich while building a nation on a foundation of sand. As we conclude this series, we're left with a sobering thought that echoes through history. Empires are not defeated by enemies, but by their own spending. If $2 trillion can vanish into the dust of Afghanistan, what other truths has history hidden from us? What other stories of power, money, and consequence are waiting to be told? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this series valuable, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world.